7:34 a.m. June 12, 1979. Alan Savory stood in a Montana pasture watching Walter Bartholomew move a herd of cattle across land that had been diagnosed as irreversibly damaged. The Bureau of Land Management had tried to restore it with limited grazing. The Soil Conservation Service had recommended rest rotation. The Agricultural Extension Office had suggested reseeding with native grasses. Every attempt had made the land worse. Bartholomew was doing the opposite. He was putting more cattle on degraded ground and moving them faster. The BLM had told him it would accelerate desertification. Instead, the grass was coming back. What Bartholomew understood, and what would take federal agencies another 15 years to acknowledge, came down to a pattern so obvious that 4 decades of rangeland research had studied everything except the thing that mattered. The problem experts had been trying to solve since 1934 was overgrazing. The problem that actually existed was the absence of animal impact in the right concentration at the right time. Those are not the same thing. Confusing them cost the American West approximately 240 million acres of productive grassland between 1930 and 1980. The solution had been working on ranches across Montana, Wyoming, and Alberta since the late 1950s. Nobody with institutional authority had bothered to ask why. In 1934, Congress passed the Taylor Grazing Act in direct response to the Dust Bowl. The act created grazing districts across 80 million acres of federal land and established the Division of Grazing, which later became the Bureau of Land Management. The foundational assumption was simple and appeared self-evident. Too many cattle on too much land for too long had destroyed the soil structure. The solution was to reduce animal numbers and extend rest periods. Every federal land management policy for the next 40 years operated on that assumption. The Soil Conservation Service published standards in 1936. They calculated carrying capacity in animal unit months per acre. An animal unit month was defined as the amount of forage consumed by 1,000-pound cow with calf in 30 days. The standard recommendation for arid rangeland was 35 to 50 acres per AUM. Grazing was to be distributed evenly across the entire allotment for the entire season. If the land showed signs of degradation, the prescribed remedy was to reduce stocking rates or increase rest periods. Between 1936 and 1975, the BLM reduced permitted AUMs on public rangeland by approximately 38%. The land continued to deteriorate. By 1955, the condition of federal rangeland was worse than it had been in 1934. The BLM's own surveys documented the decline. Range condition was classified into 4 categories: excellent, good, fair, and poor. Excellent range had a plant composition dominated by climax species with minimal soil erosion. Poor range was characterized by invasive species, exposed soil, and active gully formation. In 1936, approximately 17% of surveyed rangeland was classified as excellent or good. By 1955, that figure had dropped to 12%. The percentage classified as poor had increased from 32% to 41%. The federal response was not to question the underlying theory. It was to apply the theory more aggressively. In 1960, the BLM introduced formal rest rotation grazing systems. The concept was developed by August Horme, a range conservationist working for the Forest Service. Horme had been studying rangeland recovery on the Lassen National Forest in California. His system divided grazing allotments into multiple pastures. Each pasture was grazed for a fixed period, then rested for a year or more. The theory was that extended rest periods would allow plants to recover root reserves and produce seed. Rest rotation systems were implemented across millions of acres of western rangeland between 1960 and 1975. The BLM published detailed management plans specifying the rotation schedule, the season of use, and the maximum duration of grazing for each pasture. Ranchers were required to move livestock according to the prescribed schedule. Compliance was monitored through annual inspections. The results did not match the predictions. In some locations, plant diversity decreased under rest rotation management. In others, invasive species increased during the rest periods. The BLM documented these outcomes but interpreted them as evidence that the systems needed refinement, not reconsideration. Between 1960 and 1980, the agency published 47 technical reports on grazing management. None questioned whether continuous light grazing or long rest periods might themselves be causing harm. The pattern that federal researchers were not seeing had been understood by ranchers for more than 20 years. It had been articulated in ecological terms by Alan Savory, a Rhodesian game biologist, in 1969, and it had been practiced successfully by Walter Bartholomew on his ranch near Ennis, Montana since 1957. Bartholomew had not read Savory's work. He had not consulted with the BLM or the Soil Conservation Service. He had watched his land fail under conventional grazing management and decided to try the opposite of what he had been told to do. Walter Bartholomew was born in 1911 in Sheridan County, Montana. He started ranching in 1935 on 4,800 acres of mixed ownership, partly private and partly leased from the state. He followed standard practice for the region. He kept approximately 240 head of cattle on the land year-round, moving them seasonally between summer and winter pastures. The stocking rate was conservative, approximately 30 acres per AUM. By 1950, the land was in decline. Native grasses were being replaced by sagebrush and cheatgrass. Erosion was visible along drainage channels. Bartholomew reduced his herd to 180 head. The land got worse. In 1956, Bartholomew attended a workshop on ranch management in Miles City. One of the speakers mentioned a rancher in Alberta who was using high-density short-duration grazing. The system involved concentrating the entire herd into a small area for 1 or 2 days, then moving them to fresh ground. The speaker did not advocate the system. He mentioned it as an example of an experimental approach that had not been formally evaluated. Bartholomew wrote down the name of the Alberta rancher. He drove to Alberta in the spring of 1957 and spent 4 days observing the operation. The Alberta rancher, whose name was recorded in Bartholomew's notes as Lawrence McRae, was running 400 head on 6,000 acres. McRae had divided the land into 48 paddocks using temporary electric fencing. The herd spent 2 days in each paddock, then moved to the next. The full rotation took 96 days. Each paddock was then rested for the remainder of the growing season, a period of approximately 90 to 120 days depending on elevation and precipitation. McRae told Bartholomew that he had been using the system for 5 years. Plant diversity had increased. Soil compaction had decreased. He had not reduced his herd numbers, he had increased them. Bartholomew returned to Montana and began planning a similar system. He divided his summer range into 36 paddocks using a combination of existing fences and temporary electric wire. He calculated that with 240 head, he could graze each paddock for 1 to 2 days and achieve a full rotation in approximately 60 days. The key variable was stocking density. Instead of spreading 240 head across 4,800 acres, he would concentrate them on 130 acres at a time. The density was roughly 1.8 head per acre during the grazing period. After the herd moved, each paddock would rest for 60 days before the next rotation. He implemented the system in May 1957. Within 6 weeks, he could see differences in plant recovery. The grasses in the first paddocks grazed were taller and denser than plants in adjacent areas that had been rested without concentrated grazing. By the end of the growing season, the contrast was visible from a distance. Bartholomew documented the change with photographs taken from fixed points. The images showed increased ground cover and reduced bare soil in the paddocks that had been grazed at high density and then rested. Bartholomew reported the results to the county extension agent in the fall of 1957. The agent visited the ranch and confirmed the visual improvement. He did not recommend the system to other ranchers. In his written notes filed with the Montana Agricultural Extension Service, the agent stated that the observed improvement might be attributable to above-average precipitation that year and that high-density grazing was inconsistent with accepted carrying capacity standards. Bartholomew continued the system. By 1960, he had expanded his herd to 320 head. The land supported the increase without degradation. By 1965, he was running 380 head on the same acreage. The stocking rate had increased from 30 acres per AUM to approximately 19 acres per AUM. The range condition had improved from fair to good based on BLM classification standards. Other ranchers in the region noticed. Between 1960 and 1970, at least 14 ranchers in Montana and Wyoming implemented variations of high-density short-duration grazing. The systems varied in detail but shared core principles: high animal concentration, short grazing periods, and long rest intervals. None of the ranchers coordinated their efforts. Most did not know the others existed. They had each observed that conventional low-density grazing was failing and decided to experiment. The federal agencies did not investigate. In 1968, a range conservationist with the Soil Conservation Service visited 3 Montana ranches using rotational grazing systems. His report, filed in the SCS regional office in Bozeman, noted improved vegetative cover but concluded that the systems were labor-intensive and difficult to replicate at scale. The report recommended continued emphasis on reduced stocking rates and extended rest periods. Alan Savory had reached a different conclusion through a different route. Savory was born in southern Rhodesia in 1935. He trained as a biologist and worked for the Rhodesian Department of Wildlife from 1955 to 1969. His primary responsibility was managing game populations in areas where habitat degradation was attributed to overgrazing by wild herbivores. The standard management prescription was to cull the herds. Savory participated in culling operations that killed thousands of elephants and buffalo. The land did not recover. In some areas, it deteriorated faster after the animals were removed. Savory began studying the ecological history of African grasslands. He learned that the grasses had evolved under intense grazing pressure from massive herds of migratory herbivores. The herds did not distribute evenly across the landscape. They concentrated in tight groups for protection from predators. They grazed an area intensively for a short period, then moved on. The grasses had adapted to that pattern. They required the disturbance. Savory developed a theoretical framework in 1969 that he called holistic resource management. The core principle was that brittle environments, defined as regions with seasonal rainfall and long dry periods, required periodic disturbance from concentrated herbivore activity to maintain soil health and plant diversity. Without disturbance, dead plant material accumulated on the soil's surface, preventing new growth and reducing water infiltration. Fire could provide disturbance, but fire was unpredictable and often destructive. Controlled grazing by livestock could replicate the ecological function of wild herds. Savory left Rhodesia in 1979 after the country transitioned to majority rule and became Zimbabwe. He moved to the United States and began consulting with ranchers. One of his first visits was to Walter Bartholomew's ranch in Montana. Savory arrived in June 1979 expecting to teach Bartholomew his system. Instead, he found that Bartholomew had been practicing the core principles for 22 years without any theoretical framework or institutional support. The visit was documented in Savory's field notes, archived at the Savory Institute in Boulder, Colorado. Savory described Bartholomew's land as the most dramatic example of grassland recovery I have yet observed in North America. He noted that the system Bartholomew had developed was operationally similar to the management protocols Savory was recommending, but had been arrived at independently through observation and trial. Savory's framework provided a scientific explanation for why Bartholomew's system worked. The key was animal impact. Cattle hooves broke up soil crust, pressed seed into the ground, and created microenvironments for germination. Manure and urine provided nutrients. Grazing removed old plant material and stimulated new growth. The effect was positive only if the animals were concentrated enough to create disturbance, and only if they moved away before they could overgraze regrowth. Spreading animals evenly across a large area provided neither adequate impact nor adequate rest. The federal agencies did not shift their policies based on Savory's work or Bartholomew's example. In 1974, the BLM had commissioned a comprehensive review of rangeland condition on public lands. The report, completed in 1975 and known as the Range Analysis, found that only 16% of BLM rangeland was in excellent or good condition. The report attributed the decline to continued overuse by livestock and recommended further reductions in permitted grazing. The recommendation was implemented. Between 1975 and 1985, the BLM reduced permitted AUMs by an additional 12%. Ranchers using rotational grazing systems were producing the opposite results. In 1982, a group of Montana ranchers formed an informal network to share information about grazing management. The network included Walter Bartholomew, who was 71 years old and still actively ranching. The group began documenting their results systematically. They used BLM range condition assessment protocols to evaluate their own land. They collected data on stocking rates, precipitation, plant composition, and soil organic matter. The data showed consistent improvements. Ranches using high-density short-duration grazing had increased plant diversity, reduced erosion, and higher stocking rates compared to ranches using conventional management on similar soils and precipitation zones. The ranchers compiled the data into a report and submitted it to the Montana BLM office in 1984. The report included photographs, vegetative surveys, and stocking rate comparisons for 18 ranches. The BLM did not publish the report or modify its management recommendations. The turning point came from outside the United States. In 1985, researchers in Australia published a study comparing continuous grazing, rest rotation grazing, and short-duration high-intensity grazing on semi-arid rangeland in Queensland. The study was conducted over 8 years on 6 experimental sites. The results showed that short-duration high-intensity grazing produced higher plant biomass, greater species diversity, and improved soil structure compared to both continuous grazing and rest rotation systems. The Australian study was published in the Journal of Range Management in September 1985. It was the first peer-reviewed research that validated what ranchers like Bartholomew had been observing for decades. The study's lead author, Dr. Neil MacLeod, attributed the results to the combination of animal impact and recovery time. He noted that previous research had focused on grazing intensity, measured as the percentage of available forage consumed, without considering the duration of grazing or the concentration of animals. The BLM began piloting rotational grazing systems in 1988. The initial pilots were small-scale and treated as experimental. They were implemented on 5 grazing allotments in Nevada and Montana. The results were monitored for 3 years. In 1991, the BLM published a technical report concluding that rotational grazing could improve range condition in some contexts but required site-specific planning and increased management complexity. The language was cautious, but the shift was significant. For the first time, the BLM acknowledged that increased animal concentration could be beneficial rather than harmful. The agency began offering technical assistance to ranchers interested in implementing rotational grazing. By 1995, approximately 200 grazing allotments on BLM land were managed using some form of rotational system. By 2005, that number had increased to over 1,200. Walter Bartholomew died in 1994 at the age of 83. He had ranched the same land for 59 years. At the time of his death, his ranch supported 420 head of cattle on 4,800 acres, a stocking rate nearly double what he had started with in 1935. The land was classified as excellent range condition by BLM standards. His obituary in the Bozeman Daily Chronicle mentioned his service as a county commissioner and his membership in the Montana Stockgrowers Association. It did not mention his grazing system. The principle Bartholomew discovered is now embedded in modern regenerative agriculture. It is taught in range management courses at land-grant universities. It is recommended by the Natural Resources Conservation Service as a conservation practice eligible for federal cost-share funding. The ecological mechanism is well understood. Perennial grasses in brittle environments require disturbance to prevent senescence. The disturbance must be intense enough to break dormancy but brief enough to allow recovery. Wild herbivores provided that disturbance through predator-driven herd behavior. Managed livestock can replicate it through controlled rotation. The modern systems are more sophisticated than Bartholomew's original design. Ranchers use GPS collars to track herd movement. They use soil moisture sensors to determine optimal grazing timing. They use drones to assess forage availability across large landscapes, but the core principle remains identical: concentration, movement, and rest. The cost of solving the wrong problem for 40 years is difficult to quantify precisely. The BLM estimated in a 1995 report that approximately 68 million acres of public rangeland had declined from good to fair or fair to poor condition between 1936 and 1985. The primary management intervention during that period was reduced stocking and extended rest. The ecological damage included loss of topsoil, invasion by woody species, reduction in water infiltration capacity, and decline in native plant diversity. The economic cost to ranchers included lost productivity, reduced herd sizes, and forfeited grazing permits. The federal government spent an estimated $1.2 billion between 1960 and 1990 on range improvement projects that applied the same incorrect principle. Experts were not negligent. They were systematic. They conducted research, published findings, and implemented management plans based on peer-reviewed science. The problem was that the research asked the wrong question. It asked how to reduce grazing pressure. It did not ask whether the absence of grazing pressure might itself be harmful. The ranchers were not more intelligent. They were more exposed to the consequences of being wrong. A federal researcher whose theory failed could publish a revised theory. A rancher whose land failed lost the ranch. Bartholomew's system worked because he was not trying to validate a theory. He was trying to save his land. He observed that rest alone did not produce recovery. He observed that animals concentrated by fencing produced different effects than animals distributed across open range. He tested the observation, documented the result, and continued the practice. The scientific explanation came later. The practice came from necessity. If you know someone who ranched in Montana between 1950 and 1990, or if you have family stories about grazing management conflicts with federal agencies, leave a comment. Name your state or region. This story is still being written. The principles that took 40 years to validate are now being applied to grassland restoration projects across 6 continents. The starting point was one rancher in Montana who decided that what he was being told to do was not working, and that the cost of being wrong was too high to continue following instructions. Subscribe if you want to see more stories about the people who figured things out before the experts caught up. The transformation of rangeland management from a centralized top-down approach to a decentralized adaptive system represents something larger than agricultural technique. It demonstrates how institutions can become trapped by their own frameworks, how expertise can become an obstacle rather than an asset, and how the people closest to a problem often understand it better than the people paid to solve it. Bartholomew never published a paper. He never presented at a conference. He never sought credit or recognition. He simply made decisions every day based on what he could see happening on his land, and those decisions accumulated into a body of knowledge that contradicted the established science for over 2 decades before that science finally caught up. The story also reveals something important about how we evaluate evidence. Federal agencies had access to the same data that Bartholomew had. They could see that their policies were not working. The range condition surveys documented deterioration year after year. The technical reports acknowledged the problem, but acknowledgement of failure and willingness to change direction are not the same thing. Institutions develop invested interests in their existing frameworks. Scientists become identified with particular theories. Budget allocations get tied to specific programs. Admitting that you have been solving the wrong problem for 40 years is not just an intellectual challenge, it is an organizational threat. Bartholomew encountered resistance not because his system was unproven, but because it was unprovable within the existing framework. The BLM had developed a standardized system for measuring range condition. That system was based on plant species composition and soil erosion indicators. Bartholomew's land improved dramatically on those very metrics, but because he had achieved improvement through high-density grazing instead of reduced grazing, the data could not be accepted at face value. The improvement must be explained away as coincidence or temporary. The framework had to be preserved, even if it meant dismissing evidence that contradicted it. This pattern repeats throughout the history of institutional error. It is not stupidity that perpetuates failed approaches. It is the structure of institutions themselves. Once a large organization commits to a particular solution, that solution becomes embedded in hearing practices, training curricula, budget allocations, and performance metrics. Everyone in the organization is trained to implement the solution. People build careers defending it. External critics are dismissed as uninformed. Internal doubters are marginalized. The only thing that can break the pattern is either external validation so overwhelming that it cannot be ignored or generational replacement so complete that the original architects are no longer present to defend their legacy. The Australian study provided the external validation. It was conducted by researchers with no connection to the Montana ranchers and no ideological commitment to their approach. It used rigorous experimental design with controls and replication. It was published in a peer-reviewed journal, but notice that it took international research to validate what American ranchers had been doing for 30 years. Notice that the validation had to come from outside the institutional framework that had rejected it domestically. Notice that even after the Australian study was published, the BLM did not suddenly reverse course. It began a careful pilot program. It gradually modified its recommendations. Institutional change lags behind evidence by years or decades, not because the evidence is unclear, but because institutions change slowly. The deeper lesson from Bartholomew's story is about epistemic humility. He knew something that the experts did not know, not because he was smarter, but because he had different information. He experienced the direct consequences of land management decisions. He could not blame failure on external variables or argue that his theory just needed refinement. His livelihood depended on the land responding to his management. That dependency created a powerful incentive for accurate observation and honest evaluation. When what you are being told to do is failing and when you have no one to blame but yourself, you tend to notice pretty quickly. That kind of accountability is increasingly rare in modern institutions. Experts can remain convinced of their correctness across decades of failed outcomes because the consequences of failure are distributed, delayed, or absorbed by someone else. A federal land management policy affects thousands of ranchers across millions of acres. No single decision-maker experiences the full impact. By the time the effects become undeniable, the people who made the original decision have retired or moved to different positions. The institution absorbs criticism without the individuals involved suffering significant consequences. Bartholomew experienced consequences directly. Every year that his land did not recover was a year that his ranch became less viable. Every conversation with a neighbor who had also tried conventional management and failed reinforced the evidence that something was wrong with the approach. Every photograph he took documenting improvement was a form of evidence he was creating for himself, a record he could review to confirm that he was on the right track. He did not have the luxury of academic distance or institutional insulation. The story of Walter Bartholomew also illustrates something about the relationship between theory and practice that most people get backwards. We tend to assume that good practice flows from good theory. We assume that you need to understand something scientifically before you can do it successfully. In reality, practice often comes first. People figure out how to do things through trial and error, observation and experimentation, long before anyone explains why those things work. Science comes later to provide the theoretical framework, the mechanistic explanation, the validation that allows the practice to be taught at scale and adopted more widely. Bartholomew did not need to understand the ecology of brittle environments or the physiological mechanisms of grass dormancy to make his system work. He did not need to know about holistic resource management or the behavioral ecology of herbivores. He needed to be willing to notice that what he was doing was not working and to try something different. He needed to document the results. He needed to persist when the county extension agent dismissed his observations. He needed the confidence to trust his own data more than the official recommendations. All of that took courage, but none of it required advanced training. This suggests something important about how we might approach other institutional problems. We might be looking for solutions that are too complicated, too dependent on expertise that does not yet exist, too far in the future. Meanwhile, simpler solutions might be available to anyone with the willingness to observe carefully and question established wisdom. Maybe the problem is not that we lack information, but that we are not listening to the people who have it. Maybe the problem is that we have centralized knowledge production in institutions that have strong incentives to preserve existing approaches. The work of regenerating degraded rangeland continues. There are now thousands of ranchers across North America, Australia, Africa, and South America applying principles that Bartholomew discovered through experimentation. They use modern technology and scientific understanding that was not available in 1957, but the core innovation remains his: the insight that concentration plus movement plus rest could produce recovery. That understanding was not transmitted through universities or government agencies. It was transmitted through networks of ranchers, through farmer-to-farmer extension, through the slow accumulation of observation shared informally between neighbors and friends. Walter Bartholomew's ranch still operates today, decades after his death. It is still managed using rotational grazing systems descended from the paddocks he designed in 1957. The land is still in excellent condition. New ranchers visit it every year to learn from the landscape itself, to see what recovery looks like, to understand that intensive management focused on animal impact can produce healthier ecosystems than hands-off preservation or extraction-focused agriculture. The ranch is a living laboratory, a demonstration that the principle works not just in theory but in practice, year after year, across decades and generations. If this story resonates with you, if you have observed your own institutions making similar mistakes, if you have seen people in positions of authority defend approaches that are clearly not working, please share this. Help other people understand that sometimes the most important innovations come from the margins, from the people closest to the problem who are willing to question what they have been told. And if you value this kind of deep storytelling about overlooked history and institutional change, please subscribe to this channel. We explore these stories regularly, the places where practice led theory, where outsiders figured it out before insiders would admit it, where the most important work happens in silence while everyone watches the wrong thing.